In the interests of market research, hands up all those who really, really are enjoying the food. Okay, that's good. That's wonderful, thank you. This report was launched last May 1st by 2015's Australian of the Year, Rosie Batty, in front of 250 people at Melbourne Town Hall. Perhaps the key finding of the report into Australia's first research into family violence and brain injury was that 2 in every 5 of the 16,000 victims of family violence attending Victorian hospitals over the last decade had sustained a brain injury. As alarming as a rate of 40% is, as dramatic a finding as this is, hospitalisations for brain injury as a result of family violence, comprehensively mapped and mined as part of this research, are bound to be just the proverbial tip of the iceberg. For example, a 2016 survey of over 100 clients of 5 domestic violence shelters in the United States found 9 in every 10 reported a head injury or loss of consciousness from family violence. And of those, again, 9 in every 10 reported, quote, too many head injuries to quantify. Yet only 1 in every 5 ever sought medical attention. Up until very recently, Karen Mason was Executive Director of the Kelowna Women's Shelter in British Columbia, Canada. Paul van Donkelaar is a Professor in the School of Health and Exercise Sciences at the University of British Columbia. Together, they are the co-founders of Supporting Survivors of Abuse and Brain Injury Through Research, or SOAR. Brain Injury Australia is delighted and honoured that they have made their way from Canada to share their expertise and experience. Please welcome Karen and Paul.
Now, normally when we speak in our country, we would start by acknowledging the traditional First Nations territories on which we stand and thank the local First Nation Indigenous community for allowing us to be here. I know you have similar protocols, but I don't know them, so forgive me if I butchered it, but I am acknowledging that same thing at the beginning of our talk.
So thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak. We've followed the work of Brain Injury Australia and been interacting with Nick for a few years now since we launched this project, and it's a great honor to be able to come and speak here today.
So before we get started, I have a question. Who in the room is single? Put up your hand. All right. Thank you.
So how many of you have tried online dating? Put up your hand. Have any of you tried these sites? How's that going for you?
Don't worry, we get it. Right, online dating can be incredibly frustrating. There may be plenty of fish in the sea, but finding the one you want to take home, it's not so easy. But we get it. We're here today not only to give you some really important information that we feel pretty passionately about, but to give those of you who are looking for love online a little bit of hope. Because 4.5 years ago, Paul and I swiped right. It's true. He's so cute, right? Who wouldn't swipe right? He's also very smart and the kindest man I've ever met, so that's kind of important. But not only did we fall madly in love, but we quickly realized that the universe had some very big plans for us in terms of our careers.
So let's back up a little bit to tell you a little bit about where we come from. So, as Nick has said, I'm a professor in the School of Health and Exercise Sciences at the University of British Columbia's Okanagan campus in Kelowna, British Columbia. And for much of my career, I've been examining brain injury in the context of collision or contact sports related concussion. And my lab uses a number of different objective tools to assess sports concussion in the lab. So we do things like look at cerebral blood flow, neurocognitive function, sensory motor function, and recently we started doing blood biomarker work in this field. And like most labs in the world that look at sports concussion, we take a variety of different approaches. The most obvious one is you take a group of athletes who, in Canada's case, play either ice hockey or American football, and you know that some of them are going to get a concussion, and so you measure them at the beginning of the season as a group, and then you basically wait, and then about 10 to 15% of them will get a sports concussion at some point during the season. And then if they agree, you bring them back into the lab, and we try to get them into the lab within 3 days of their injury, measure them again on some of these assessments, and then follow them and track their recovery over the course of the following weeks to months. A second approach we use is one that's been motivated by some more recent work looking at the effects of, the chronic effects of subconcussive head impacts in these sports. So not getting diagnosed with a concussion, but nevertheless being exposed to repetitive head impacts or body impacts. So for that research, we again measure them at the beginning of the season. We wait for them to play throughout their season and have all their practices and games, and then we bring them in at the end of the season to measure them again and look for changes in function as a result of those head impacts. And quite often in that research, we'll have the players actually wear a head impact sensor, so we can correlate the changes in performance from pre to post season with basically the load of the head impacts that they received. And then a final protocol that we've used in my lab is actually in the context of soccer heading. So there's been a number of recent reports looking at the potential negative consequences of soccer heading over the longer term. But what we've done in my lab is to shorten that down to an acute bout of soccer heading. So believe it or not, we got ethics approval to have soccer players come into the lab and head the soccer ball 40 times in 20 minutes, which is a pretty heavy load. They practice this anyway in the course of their season, but we scrunched it down to a pretty short time. And again, measure before and after and look for changes and then make inferences about how that might have some impact in terms of soccer heading.
So when Paul and I met, I was the executive director of Kelowna Women's Shelter, which is an organization that serves women and women with children fleeing intimate partner violence. The organization offers a variety of services, including emergency and transitional shelter, officially a 30-day maximum stay, but women often stay much longer than that, but also a range of other services in the community, education for children and youth, and support groups for women. So we serve women of every socioeconomic background, every demographic, and they don't necessarily need to stay in shelter to use the services of the organization. Did you know in North America, 1 in 3 women will experience intimate partner violence in her lifetime? Every 2.5 days in Canada, a woman or girl is killed violently, usually at the hands of a male partner or a male family member. And every night in our country, more than 6,000 women and children seek refuge from violence at the hands of a partner in a shelter like Kelowna Women's Shelter. We know violence against women is a global public health crisis. It is an issue in Australia as well, particularly when it comes to Indigenous populations who are most highly at risk. We have the same experience in Canada. I know a recent report from your Australian Institutes of Health and Welfare says 1 in 6 women in Australia will experience IPV, and that 1 woman is killed every 9 days. I would like to suggest that intimate partner violence and women being killed by partners is not happening any less than it is in Canada and Australia. I would posit that the statistics in both countries don't tell the reality, because we know the shame and stigma still associated with this issue means it goes highly underreported. And here's the thing. Most incidents of physical intimate partner violence involve blows to the face, head, and neck, and strangulation, all of which can cause brain injury. And I'd like to make a point for everybody that the word we really need to use is strangulation. Choking is something that happens inside when you swallow something or something gets lodged in your throat. Strangulation is that external cause, and we need to call it as such. We also know that up to 92% of survivors of intimate partner violence have also suffered a brain injury. So it's pretty extreme.
And yet much of the research that's been done and much of the information that makes its way into the media is around the brain injuries that tend to occur in the context of sports. So there's lots of examples, both in North America and here in Australia, about the concerns around that. And we heard some of the previous, in the previous session, talking about how parents are actually concerned for their kids, and maybe it's a little bit too conservative in terms of the cost and the benefit associated with playing sports. But how do the numbers really look? So how do we get a comparison between what happens in, say, sports concussion versus what happens in IPV-related TBI? So there was a study a few years ago done by the Centers for Disease Control in the United States. It was a survey of over 10,000 people, men and women, about their experiences, whether they had any experiences of intimate partner violence. And one of the results of the survey was that 2.3% of women in the United States that participated in this study had experienced a severe incident of intimate partner violence in the previous year. And by severe, it meant that a physical injury had occurred. And as we just saw, the 92% tends to be directed towards the head, face, or neck. To put that in the context of people here in Australia, I looked it up online, and there are 6.3 million women in Australia between the ages of 18 and 54. If we take the 2.3% from the CDC study, that works out to 144,000 women every year in Australia will experience severe intimate partner violence and likely get a traumatic brain injury as a result. The 92% number that Karen quoted previously means that about 133,000 women will experience an IPV-related brain injury every year in Australia. So these are big numbers, and they really need to be taken into account. Next, I wanted to, again, try and put it in the context of a popular sport here in Australia. Normally, we compare it to hockey in Canada and North America. So we talk about the National Hockey League and how many concussions occur in the National Hockey League. So I talked to a colleague of mine, Dr. Sandy Schultz, who is a member of the Neurotrauma Research Unit here at Monash University, and asked about concussion rates within the Australian Rules Football League. And he sent me some information which estimated that there are about 7 concussions per team per year in the AFL. So I looked up how many teams there were in the AFL, and I believe there's 18. And so that works out to about 126 concussions per year in the AFL. So if we make then that comparison to the number of women who experience an IPV-related TBI in Australia every year, for every one AFL player that we hear about getting a concussion, and there's a news story typically about, there's about 1,000 Australian women who get the same injury at the hands of their loved one.
So these are some of the main ways that women can experience a traumatic brain injury in an intimate partner violence relationship. Being punched or hit in the head with an object, or being kicked in the head, very common, violently shaken, thrown out of a moving vehicle. One of our clients at Kelowna Women's Shelter, that was her story, and she came very close to dying. And strangled. Again, it's very common. Nearly half of survivors have been strangled, and it's really important to note that strangulation is one of the top indicators of a future fatality for a woman. But as I mentioned before, women often don't report. And we always get asked that question, well, why not? Or why doesn't she leave? And it's such a complex and nuanced thing. First of all, that shame and stigma piece. She doesn't want to admit to herself, to her friends, to her family that this is the relationship that she's in. There's the fear of further harm or death. We know that a woman is most at risk for severe physical harm or death at the time of leaving a relationship or soon afterwards. So in fact, she's safer to stay there in a lot of cases. There's the whole piece of not being believed. How often do we question women and suggest that it's their fault? And then they believe it's their fault because that's what their partner tells them all the time. If you didn't say this or do this, I wouldn't have to hit you. The other really important piece that I think we tend to forget, this is the man she loves. He's not a monster all the time. If he was, it would be easier to leave, but he's not. And this is her normal. This is what she lives every day. And in many cases we've found it wouldn't even cross a woman's mind that she had a head injury after he hit her again or knocked her down the stairs again. And it wouldn't even cross her mind to go seek medical attention because this is her normal.
So what do we see in terms of signs and symptoms in this population? It's some of the same things that you see in pretty much every population that has a brain injury of some sort. So you can see the symptoms there that are relatively common in sports concussion, in more serious brain injury, and they seem to also be occurring in this population as well. There's been a little bit of research around what the experience is like in terms of women who've had a traumatic brain injury as a result of intimate partner violence. This is a study by Amanda St. Ivany from a couple of years ago. Basically a qualitative interview with survivors, asking them to describe the things they are going through. And there's a number of key words and phrases here that just sound exactly like what you'd expect if someone's had a brain injury. So damaged brain, hammer headache, migraine, forgetful, desire for quiet, and probably the most obvious one is he liked to hit me in the head. So this, again, is something that's happening on a regular basis.
So all of this can make it difficult for any woman to get through the day and to live her life. But if she's staying in a communal living situation at a women's shelter, and she's dealing with the trauma and the anxiety and the angst and the depression and the panic, finally having left this abusive relationship and all the things she has to sort out, it makes it particularly difficult. This is how it will often show itself. We've had some discussion today about challenging behaviors as a result of brain injury. These are all the sorts of things, ways that will manifest when a woman is staying in a shelter. And staff at women's shelters, at least in North America, and I presume here, have no training in traumatic brain injury. They don't know the signs and symptoms. They don't understand the particular challenges and how they might support a woman dealing with it. So they think they have a woman who's challenging and oppositional and refuses to do chores and can't remember anything and yells at her children and yells at the other staff. And they would often, sometimes end up redlining a woman or red circling a woman, and she would get kicked out of shelter or refuse service in other agencies, and yet she's the one who needs the support the most. So what this tells us is not only do staff not know what they need to know to support women, but many of the women don't even know they have a brain injury and require special supports. So very soon after Paul and I swiped right, and given everything we've discussed that we knew, I saw this article, and I promptly forwarded it to my wonderful boyfriend and said, I won't say what I actually said because this is a family-friendly audience, forget football players, we need to study women.
And so, as a good scientist, after Karen sent me this article, I scoured the literature, and it took about 2 minutes to find all the articles that were directly relevant to the intersection between intimate partner violence and traumatic brain injury. So there are a handful of articles. I think it's almost to about 30 articles total now in the history of time that have looked at this intersection. A lot of those articles tend to be descriptive and observational about some of the things that we've just spent a few minutes talking about, the kind of prevalence and the incidence and some of the signs and symptoms that you might see. And there are only 3 and now 4 articles that look specifically at brain function in this population, and I'll describe the one shortly in terms of, because it's our first article that came out on this particular topic. To put that into context, I did a search last night on one of the research bibliographic websites. And this year alone, there's been over 3,600 articles, peer-reviewed scientific articles on traumatic brain injury. That's 13 articles a day. It's no wonder that we can't keep up trying to integrate all this information. So, in response to that, we have co-founded what we're calling SOAR, Supporting Survivors of Abuse and Brain Injury Through Research. And we've been fortunate to be able to get some initial donor funding and have subsequently managed to get a bit more funding to allow this project to really take off. So what is it? Well, it's a community-engaged, multidisciplinary research partnership. We launched it a few years ago now, and it's a partnership between UBC Okanagan and my lab and a number of colleagues, both at the Okanagan campus and at the Vancouver campus, and the Kelowna Women's Shelter. Data collection for the project started just over 2 years ago now, and what our goals are to characterize the incidence and effects of IPV-related traumatic brain injury, educate and train those who work with survivors, and then create better awareness and support services for survivors in the community.
So SOAR has 3 key phases. Phase 1 involves a combination of psychosocial and lab-based assessments. We have a research coordinator who works part-time for Kelowna Women's Shelter as a counselor in the shelter and part-time for the university. And having that embedded staff member has really been critical in the success of the project so far. We know that when women are having to tell their story, they have that strong potential for being re-traumatized and triggered. For me, as executive director of the shelter, whose job it is only to protect these women, both emotionally and physically, it was critical that we do the psychosocial assessments at Kelowna Women's Shelter with a staff member who already knew the clients in a place they felt safe, where we always had 24/7 counseling support on standby just in case. So we do recruitment through Kelowna Women's Shelter and with a few other local agencies that support women. They come to Kelowna Women's Shelter and do a series of these psychosocial assessments, and they measure PTSD, anxiety, depression, trauma history, substance abuse, and brain injury severity. It takes anywhere from 2 to 3 hours, depending on the woman and how deep she gets into her story. It's pretty intense. We do pay the women $50 for that portion of the research and $50 for the portion where they go to the university. That is to help them with transportation costs or childcare costs. And in some cases, we have done childcare for women as well so that they can participate.
And this segment of the research project is actually really important in terms of accounting for those comorbidities. So we heard a little bit about this earlier in the morning session with respect to violent behaviors following traumatic brain injury in incarcerated individuals. And so there's definitely an intersection of these various psychopathological comorbidities, some history of substance use potentially, definitely trauma history, as well as the brain injury. And so teasing apart the different components is very important from a variety of perspectives, but most certainly from a scientific rigor perspective. So Karen mentioned the Brain Injury Severity Assessment tool, or the BISA. It's a tool that was developed by Dr. Eve Valera at Harvard, who's really one of the pioneers in this area of research. And she created this questionnaire for a study that she published in 2003. So really what it is, it's a series of questions about TBI signs and symptoms, but they're asked in the context of the episodes of intimate partner violence. So for example, a question might be, the last time you experienced intimate partner violence at the hands of your partner, did you see stars afterwards? Or did you have difficulty concentrating for some period of time afterwards? And if the answer is yes to any of those questions, then there's follow-up questions related to how frequently that occurred, when was the first or last time that that occurred, and how long did the symptoms actually last? In addition, there are questions around post-traumatic amnesia and loss of consciousness associated with those episodes of intimate partner violence. And by doing this questionnaire, it allows you to basically stratify what I think of as kind of the load of the head impacts or the experiences that may have led to traumatic brain injury. In particular, there's a range of scores from 0 up to 8. So 0 is that you've experienced intimate partner violence, but if it was physically violent, it was directed to some other part of your body other than your head, or potentially it was just psychological or emotional abuse. So head impacts or strangulation didn't occur, and there were no signs or symptoms of TBI as a result. 8, on the other hand, is head impacts or strangulation that occurred a very short time ago, within the last few weeks. It occurred many, many, many times over the course of many years, and quite often was quite severe in terms of causing loss of consciousness or post-traumatic amnesia. After we do these questionnaires, we bring them up to the lab and we look at various aspects of brain function that I described briefly at the outset. So one of the main things we do is look at cerebral blood flow or brain blood flow, and we use a technique that was discussed briefly in the last session called Transcranial Doppler ultrasound. And one of the main things that we're interested in using this technique for is to do an assessment of a process called cerebral autoregulation. And so I'm showing here basically the relationship between systemic blood pressure, as measured with the blood pressure cuff, and cerebral blood flow, as measured with the transcranial Doppler ultrasound. Now, the bumps that you see, the very frequent bumps that you see in each trace are those associated with the heartbeat going up and down. But then the slower transition you see in terms of the waveform is due to a manipulation that we do where it's just a simple stand squat maneuver. So they're standing, and then they drop down for a few seconds, and then they stand up again. And every time they drop down, their blood pressure goes up. And what we can do is look at the relationship between the waveform of the blood pressure change with the waveform of the cerebral blood flow velocity change. And those changes, the way they change both in time and magnitude, gives us a number of different measures of cerebral autoregulation that we can speak to in terms of the potential effect of traumatic brain injury. A second piece of fancy equipment we use is called a KinArm. It's basically a bimanual robot device that can present visual targets to participants, and then they try and interact with those targets in a variety of different ways. The one task that we focused on is indicated here. It's called the object hit and avoid task. And basically in this task, what you're meant to do is, as the name implies, hit objects that you're supposed to hit and avoid objects that you're not supposed to hit. And you do this with both of the robot arms. So I've got a brief segment of video here, and in this video, the participants are meant to hit the vertical rectangles and the circles and avoid the elongated triangles and the squares. So they go along, hitting things, trying to miss things that they're not meant to hit. And over time, what happens is those things objects start to fall from the top of the screen faster and faster and faster. So eventually you're going like this, and every once in a while you mess up, and you make errors. And so we can measure basically how accurate they are and how quickly they're able to hit some of those targets. So what have we found? Not that. This is what we found so far in terms of the BISA, the Brain Injury Severity Assessment score. So remember I talked about that range of scores from 0 to 8. And I should also mention that this is just for the data that we have, all of the data completed in the participants. We've actually tested almost 60 participants now over the last 2 years, and we have complete data in just over 20. And so you can see that for the BISA score, we have one participant out of those 20 or 25 or so that scored 0, and then increasing numbers all the way up to 5 or 6, and then still a few participants out there at 7 and 8. So really, most of the participants have quite a heavy load of head impacts or strangulation as part of their experience of intimate partner violence and have TBI signs and symptoms that go along with that. One thing that we included in the BISA that wasn't included in Dr. Valera's original form was a question or questions around strangulation. And so with that, we were able to kind of get an idea of how the different experiences of intimate partner violence were related to either strangulation, head impacts, or some combination of the two. So this graph is showing the average number of incidents across all of those participants for strangulation alone, head impacts alone, and combined strangulation and head impacts. And you can see that most participants, it was head impacts or combined with strangulation, and really only a few of the episodes were due to strangulation alone. And we're hoping that over time, I mean, it's horrible to say, but it would be interesting to know if the experience in terms of brain function of strangulation is any different from the experience due to the force of a head impact coming into the brain or the combined experience. So we're hopeful that over time, we'll get enough participants that have just strangulation for us to be able to make some inferences about how that specifically affects brain function independent of head impacts. One of the first things that we did was just to look at the TBI symptoms using the Sport Concussion Assessment tool, or the SCAT. So it's a commonly used tool for sports concussion. And we were just interested, given that our lab had spent the last 25 years or so looking at sport-related concussion, how participants who've experienced intimate partner violence responded to the question on the SCAT compared to young athletes. And so the advantage of spending 25 years looking at sports concussion is we have a lot of data on pre and post concussion in young athletes. And so what I'm showing here is the number of symptoms on the Sport Concussion Assessment tool in young athletes at preseason and then immediately or within 3 days of their injury. And so you can see that the number of symptoms goes up. We saw that earlier as well in terms of kind of a classic sign of the impact of a concussion. And what I'm showing on the right are survivors of intimate partner violence, and then a small group of matched controls. That really should be in quotation marks. They're matched in terms of age and education level, but they've suffered neither a TBI nor intimate partner violence. And so the main point to take away from this is that the intimate partner violence survivors have as many or even more symptoms after their experiences or when we have them come into the lab to test them. Now, the scary part about this is these folks were measured 3 days at the longest after their injury. And this group, the earliest we measured someone was 3 months after the most recent episode. And on average, it was about a year that they had previously experienced their most recent episode of intimate partner violence. So that tells you right away that these are chronic symptoms. They're living with these symptoms on a daily basis. Next, we looked at how the number of symptoms in the intimate partner violence survivor group was related to the Brain Injury Severity Assessment, or BISA score. And so what we have here, each individual dot is one of the participants that makes up this bar in the bar graph. And you can see that there's a significant and positive correlation between the number of symptoms on the SCAT and the BISA score. So women who scored low on the BISA tended to have fewer symptoms, chronic symptoms, than women who scored high on the BISA. Next, in terms of cerebral autoregulation, we have the same sort of relationship, except now it's a significant negative correlation. And what I'm plotting here on the y-axis is the cerebral autoregulatory gain. So it's really a measure of how much of the change in magnitude in the blood pressure made its way into the change in magnitude in cerebral blood velocity. And so women who scored low on the BISA score tended to have a higher gain, so their blood vessels were more pliable and able to accommodate the changes in blood pressure, whereas women who scored higher on the BISA tended to have a reduced cerebral autoregulatory gain. And this is indicative of an arterial stiffening, which is consistent with quite often some of the longer-term neurodegeneration that we could often see in mild cognitive impairment or dementia. Finally, in terms of the object hit and avoid task, we came up with a measure called an aborted distractor hit. You probably didn't notice it in the example I showed you, but these are individual movements within each session where they start to make a movement towards one of the targets that they're not supposed to hit. And then they stop themselves. They abort the trial, or they abort that movement. And what I'm showing here are the number of aborted distractor hits in the intimate partner violence survivors versus a group of the soccer heading participants. So this is post 20 minutes of soccer heading. You have a certain level of aborted distractor hits. And in the intimate partner violence survivor, you have more of those aborted distractor hits. Again, when we look at it with respect to the BISA score, again, you get a positive, significant positive correlation. So women who scored lower on the BISA tended to have fewer aborted distractor hits than women who scored higher on the BISA. And when you think about aborted distractor hits, they're basically a proxy for being able to inhibit unwanted responses, or the converse of that is impulsivity. So just to summarize the evidence from this first phase, really the majority of the participants have definitely experienced an IPV-related TBI. The number of symptoms that we see are greater than what we typically observe in young athletes who've suffered an acute sports-related concussion. There's arterial stiffening induced by the IPV-related TBI, and that tends to be potentially going to be linked to longer-term neurodegeneration. There's a reduction in the ability to inhibit unwanted responses, or an increase in impulsivity. And really the bottom line is this looks like repeated TBIs with chronic symptoms that have the potential for long-term consequences.
So this is all really important and horrifying. What do we do with it? Phase 2 of SOAR is about creating and disseminating education and training for those who work on the front lines with women who've experienced violence. We're starting with women's shelter workers because that's where we're starting, but eventually we hope to get to everybody. As part of our research, we surveyed 150 shelter workers and managers from across Canada. We found, without a doubt, they don't know about brain injury and they want to know about brain injury so they can support their clients better. We've found 75% of shelter workers in Canada have never screened for a traumatic brain injury. In fact, though, anecdotally, we know pretty much 100% have never screened in terms of an actual screening or assessment protocol. Some who answered that they do screen were really just talking about a conversation that might happen with a client about her story, which probably includes some kind of assault and brain injury. So we know that we need to create some education for them. We also want to help them learn the signs and symptoms so that they can potentially red flag women and then get them the supports they need. So one of the ways we're doing that is we've been reviewing different TBI screening tools to try and find a validated tool that could be easily used in shelter. Workers in shelters are busy, they are chaotic environments, and they work 24 hours a day, so we had to find something simple. So we've settled on using a version of what's called the HELPS tool. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this one. It has been used in the context of intimate partner violence in some other locations, particularly in the United States. So we're adapting it a little bit. We start with have you hit your head, and we include did your partner strangle you, which is not an original part of the HELPS tool as it was first developed. Were you ever seen in the emergency room, or did you ever feel like you needed medical attention, didn't seek it? We do ask about losing consciousness, although we know head injury can occur without loss of consciousness. Do you experience any of these problems since you hit your head, and have you experienced significant sickness or physical symptoms? The goal with this is for shelter workers to start to incorporate a brain injury-informed lens into their already trauma-informed training practice, to have the conversation about brain injury with a client at some point in the first few days of a client staying at the shelter. We're also working on training materials and workshop. In fact, Paul and I, after this stop, we are headed to Taiwan for the 4th World Congress of Women's Shelters, where we're going to present some information on this topic and do some one-on-one training. So we're creating some one-on-one training that we'll be doing with shelter workers across British Columbia as well in our province next spring. But we know getting shelter workers away from shelter to do one-on-one training is tough. A lot of organizations are nonprofit and don't have the resources. So we're also working with the University of British Columbia's Vancouver campus on an IPV-focused module of this. It's the Concussion Awareness Training Tool online. It's a fabulous resource and has different modules for different audiences. So we have a script written, and we're just about to start development for an IPV-focused module. It's a quick 40-minute course you can do online from anywhere. You get a certificate at the end, and shelter workers and others who support women can learn the basics of TBI and IPV. Now, there are some other great resources out there. There are not a lot of people doing this work, but we really all try to collaborate. This is a team out of Ontario in Canada. They are just about to release this with their official launch, I believe next week or the week after, and it's called the Abused and Brain Injured Toolkit. Originally developed for shelter workers, but it has everything you could ever want to know about brain injury in intimate partner violence. So if you want to make a deep dive and learn everything on this topic, this website is a great place to go. And our colleagues in Ohio at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network have done some incredible work in this area as well. This is one of the tools they've developed for survivors to distribute at shelters and other women-serving agencies, again, to start the conversation and help women understand that this could be a factor for them, that maybe all the issues they're having are not because, as he says, she's stupid or she doesn't pay attention, but because perhaps she has a brain injury that he caused.
So then the third phase is to actually do something about it. So we're hoping to develop a community-based referral support network that would partner with a community-based brain injury support agency and our regional health authority in the Okanagan. And just like we heard with Jenny's talk yesterday and some of the talks earlier today, because this is a complex population in terms of the challenges they face, this intervention and the supports need to be multifaceted and absolutely tailored to the individual. And so that'll be a goal in working with these agencies to help them put together some programming that will respond in that way. One of the key things that we're going to do initially is to identify gaps and barriers through surveys and interviews and focus groups with the service providers, so the context into which the survivors would go, as well as the survivors themselves, to get a better understanding of the barriers and the facilitators to them accessing TBI-informed supports. And then we're going to develop and pilot test a community support network model where we'll actually be evaluating some of the programming that's being done by this community agency. And then also ask the participants themselves in terms of their response to that programming relative to some big picture questions around quality of life, resiliency, and self-esteem. And then in the longer term, some of the things we're interested in doing include designing and delivering kind of IPV or IPV-related TBI education and awareness training for brain injury support specialists, because it's kind of the flip side of providing support and increasing knowledge and awareness for those working in the IPV sector. And then there's all sorts of other sectors that you could engage with. So first responders, the justice system, as we'll hear about shortly, emergency room physicians and nurses, so on and so forth. A really big one is to examine the potential long-term neurodegenerative effects of this. So what is going to happen? What are the consequences of having these experiences earlier in life? And then finally started talking to colleagues again at UBC Vancouver about doing some neuroimaging studies to better understand some of the changes in brain function and structure that result from this experience.
So this is a big topic. There's a lot of work to be done. You know, when we started a few years ago, it was, let's figure out what's going on and let's help shelter workers be better at their jobs. But now I think we're going to spend the next 20 years trying to get the word out to everybody everywhere. So thank you for letting us come here today and tell you about it. We really appreciate it.
And we'd like to... Just like to shout out to our funders who've made this work possible, and if you want to stay in touch in any way, there's our various contact details. And remember, there's always hope. Just swipe right at the right time with the right person.
Squeeze in one or two questions. If there are one or two possible questions that need to be asked that can't wait till afternoon tea. Sarah.
Hello, that's amazing. I'm so excited to hear everything.
Sarah, can you say where you're from?
My name's Sarah. I'm from Elizabeth Morgan House, an Aboriginal women's specialised family violence service. And this is something that we are currently spending a lot of time on. Nick's been really helpful. When you were talking about, so we've just had a conversation today about strangulation, and in terms of tailoring our forms, we're having discussions about our clients and how to word these kind of things, like we're talking about how do our clients even understand what we're asking them and things like that. So we're really trying to work with your information but make it suitable to our Aboriginal clients. But I'm really excited about all this information. It's really been helpful. I did have a question. The BISA, for example, would a specialised caseworker be able to use a BISA, or do you need to be a scientist?
No. I mean, it's just asking questions around TBI signs and symptoms. It's not a diagnostic tool, but I think it really helps. The way I like to think about it is it helps you understand the amount of exposure the person has had. And so to the extent that that might help determine some of the supports that might be provided or the intensity of those supports, I think it would be useful. It's not as quick as the HELPS tool, for example, but the HELPS tool it's going to give you a 0 or a 1, right? They either had a TBI experience or they didn't, whereas the BISA is definitely going to give you more of a range of experiences.
Yeah, sure. And we have the first iteration of its first iteration draft of a brochure for shelter workers, and I have some copies. I'd be happy to give you some after.
Thank you. That'd be great. Thank you.
And I guess to follow up the using the right language, I didn't show the data, but in the Sport Concussion Assessment tool, as the name implies, they use the word concussion throughout, right? And one of the pieces of data that we got out of that was the survivors of intimate partner violence actually, when you ask them these questions and use the word concussion, they say, no, I didn't have a concussion. But then when you use the BISA and it just asks them questions about TBI signs and symptoms without ever using those words, of course, they endorse a lot more. And so it's clear that they don't understand, or they're not thinking about it in terms of a brain injury or a concussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Can you please thank Karen and Paul?